It was just another evening in a quiet suburban neighborhood. The sun had dipped below the horizon, painting the sky with shades of orange and purple. 19-year-old Amara was driving home after finishing her shift at a local bookstore where she worked part-time. She loved her job, it gave her time to read books during slow hours, and it helped pay for her college tuition. Life wasn't always easy for her, but she carried herself with grace, confidence, and a bright smile that could light up any room. Amara's car hummed softly as she navigated the familiar streets toward her house. Her mind wandered between thoughts of the new novel she'd started reading and plans for the weekend. But then, out of nowhere, flashing red and blue lights appeared in her rearview mirror. Her heart skipped a beat. What did I do? She wondered, checking her speedometer. She hadn't been speeding, hadn't run a red light. Nothing seemed out of place. She pulled over to the side of the road, gripping the steering wheel tightly as she waited for the officer to approach. 2 police officers stepped out of their patrol car behind her. They moved slowly, almost lazily, toward her vehicle. One of them tapped on her window with his flashlight. "License and registration," he said curtly, his tone devoid of warmth or politeness. Amara took a deep breath, reminding herself to stay calm. She reached into her bag for her license and opened the glove compartment to grab the registration. Papers. As she handed them over, she tried to explain politely, "I think everything is okay, I wasn't speeding or anything." But instead of listening, the officers exchanged glances and chuckled under their breaths. One of them leaned closer to the window, shining the flashlight directly into her face. Well, look what we have here," he said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "A fancy car? Designer clothes? Where are you coming from, sweetheart? Some rich kid's party?" Amara felt a knot form in her stomach. His words stung, not because they were true, but because they weren't. Yes, she dressed neatly and took pride in her appearance, but she wasn't some spoiled brat living off someone else's wealth. She worked hard for everything she had. Still, she bit her tongue and replied calmly, "No, sir. I was working at my job. I live nearby." The second officer chimed in, laughing loudly. "Oh, sure you do. You probably got lost trying to find your way back to the nice part of town." He emphasized the word nice mockingly, making it clear what he meant. Their comments kept coming, each one more hurtful than the last. At first, Amara thought maybe they were joking around, trying to lighten the mood. But as the insults piled up, it became obvious. They weren't teasing. They were mocking her. Every remark carried an undertone of disdain, as if her very presence in this neighborhood was somehow suspicious or wrong. "Maybe you should stick to places where people like you belong," one of them added, smirking. "People like me," Amara thought bitterly. What does that even mean? She wanted to argue, to tell them how unfair and disrespectful they were being. But years of being taught to de-escalate situations held her back. Arguing wouldn't help. It might make things worse. So she sat there silently, her hands trembling slightly on the steering wheel, praying the ordeal would end soon. Minutes stretched into what felt like hours. Finally, after flipping through her documents and exchanging a few muttered remarks, the officers handed her license and registration back. "Be careful out there," one of them said sarcastically before walking away. It wasn't advice, it was a warning disguised as concern. As their patrol car disappeared into the distance, Amara exhaled deeply, tears welling up in her eyes. She hadn't done anything wrong, yet she'd been treated like a criminal simply because of how she looked. For the rest of the drive home, anger and humiliation churned inside her. How could anyone treat another human being like that? And why did it feel like no matter how hard she worked or how much she achieved, certain people would always see her differently? When she finally parked in front of her house, she couldn't hold it in anymore. Bursting through the door, she collapsed onto the couch, sobbing uncontrollably. Her parents rushed to her side, alarmed by her distress. Through broken sentences, she told them everything: the stop, the mocking, the blatant disrespect. Her father listened intently, his jaw tightening with every detail. When she finished, he wrapped his arms around her protectively. "You didn't deserve that," he said firmly, his voice filled with both anger and sadness. "No one deserves to be treated that way." Little did Amara know, her story was about to take a dramatic turn, one that would not only change her life but also shine a spotlight on issues far bigger than herself. Amara's father was a man of principles, someone who had spent his entire life fighting for fairness and justice. He believed deeply in equality and worked tirelessly to create a world where everyone could feel safe and respected, regardless of their skin color or background. His position as the justice minister made him a public figure, but it also came with challenges. People often judged his family harshly, scrutinizing their every move. Despite this, he always reminded Amara and her siblings that they shouldn't let fear or prejudice define them. That night, after hearing Amara's story, he felt a mix of emotions: anger at how his daughter had been treated, frustration at the system he was trying to change, and determination to ensure something like this never happened again. He knew all too well that what happened to Amara wasn't an isolated incident. It was a symptom of a much larger problem, one rooted in bias and systemic inequality. But tonight wasn't just about statistics or policies, it was personal. This was his child, his flesh and blood, who had been humiliated simply for being herself. He hugged Amara tightly, letting her cry until she felt ready to speak again. Her mother sat beside her, holding her hand and whispering words of comfort. "You're strong," she said softly. "Stronger than they'll ever be." Once Amara calmed down, her father asked her to recount everything once more, every detail, no matter how small. He listened carefully, jotting down notes on a notepad. When she mentioned the officer's mocking comments and condescending tone, his face hardened. He promised her that they wouldn't get away with it. "This isn't just about you," he told her gently. "It's about making sure no one else has to go through this." The next morning, he wasted no time. Before heading to his office, he called his trusted team of advisors and briefed them on what had happened. He instructed them to gather as much evidence as possible: dashcam footage from the police car, any nearby security cameras, and witness statements if there were any. He wanted to build an airtight case before taking any official action. At the same time, he reached out to independent investigators known for their integrity. He didn't want anyone accusing him of using his power to settle a personal score. If anything, he wanted the process to be beyond reproach. While her father worked behind the scenes, Amara struggled to focus on her day-to-day life. She couldn't shake off the memory of the previous night. Every time she thought about those officers' smirks and sarcastic remarks, her stomach churned. She tried going to work, but even customers noticed something was off. One of her regulars, an elderly woman named Mrs. Peterson, approached her during her shift. "Is everything all right, dear?" she asked kindly. Amara hesitated, unsure if she should share what happened. But something about Mrs. Peterson's warm smile made her open up. She recounted the traffic stop, leaving out identifying details, but emphasizing how demeaning the experience had been. To her surprise, Mrs. Peterson nodded knowingly. "I'm so sorry you had to go through that," she said. "Unfortunately, stories like yours aren't uncommon. I've heard similar ones from my grandson." Mrs. Peterson's reaction gave Amara a strange sense of validation. For days, she'd wondered if she was overreacting, if maybe she'd misunderstood the officer's intentions. Hearing someone else acknowledge that her experience was real and part of a bigger pattern was comforting. Still, she couldn't help but feel frustrated. Why did people like her have to keep proving their worth over and over again? Why couldn't they just exist without constantly having to defend themselves? Meanwhile, the two officers involved in the traffic stop began to realize they might be in trouble. Officer Grayson, the younger of the two, started feeling uneasy the moment he saw Amara's last name on her license. He vaguely remembered reading about the new justice minister in the news and connecting the dots. "Do you think that's—" he stammered, turning to his partner, Officer Daniels. Daniels brushed it off at first, dismissing Grayson's concerns. "Relax," he said. "She's just some kid driving around. No big deal." But deep down, he felt a flicker of unease. He decided to check online when they got back to the station, typing her name into a search engine. That's when panic set in. Not only was her father the justice minister, but he was also a vocal advocate for reform within law enforcement. Suddenly, their harmless banter during the traffic stop didn't seem so harmless anymore. "What do we do now?" Grayson asked nervously, pacing back and forth. They both knew they'd crossed a line, but admitting fault wasn't an option. Not yet. Instead, they scrambled to cover their tracks. Daniels deleted text messages exchanged during the shift, while Grayson tried bribing a colleague into vouching for their behavior. If word got out about what they'd done, it wouldn't just cost them their jobs. It could ruin their careers forever. As the hours passed, the situation spiraled further out of control. News outlets caught wind of the incident, thanks to a bystander who had recorded part of the traffic stop on their phone. The video quickly went viral, sparking outrage across social media platforms. Protesters gathered outside the police station, holding signs that read "Accountability Now" and chanting slogans demanding justice. Hashtags like "Want Justice for Her" trended nationwide, drawing attention not only to Amara's case but also to countless others like hers. Back at home, Amara watched the chaos unfold from her bedroom window. She hadn't expected her story to blow up the way it did. Part of her felt guilty for causing such a stir, but another part felt empowered. For years, she'd been told to stay quiet, to avoid rocking the boat. Now, here she was, at the center of a movement she never intended to lead. Her father encouraged her to embrace it. "Your voice matters," he told her. "Don't let anyone silence you." The pressure mounted on the officers, too. Their captain called them into his office, visibly irritated. "What were you thinking?" he barked, slamming a printed copy of the viral video onto his desk. "You've put this entire department under scrutiny." Both men squirmed uncomfortably, unable to offer a satisfactory explanation. By the end of the meeting, they were placed on administrative leave pending an investigation. As the days turned into weeks, Amara found herself torn between anger and hope. Anger at how casually her dignity had been stripped away, and hope that her experience might spark meaningful change. She began speaking openly about what happened, sharing her story with friends, family, and eventually, journalists. Each time, she spoke. Her confidence grew. She realized that her pain wasn't just hers. It belonged to a community of people who had faced similar injustices. And together, they could demand better. Her father continued working tirelessly to hold the officers accountable, ensuring the investigation remained transparent and fair. He knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy, but he was determined to see it through. For Amara, for her generation, and for everyone who deserved to live without fear of discrimination. Through it all, Amara learned something important. Sometimes, standing up for yourself means standing up for others too. The morning after the story went viral, Amara woke up to a flood of notifications on her phone. Social media was buzzing with reactions, messages of support, shares of the video, and comments from people who had experienced similar situations. At first, she felt overwhelmed. Her private pain had become public property, dissected and discussed by strangers. But as she scrolled through the posts, something shifted inside her. She noticed how many people were saying, "This happened to me too," or "I've been scared to speak up, but hearing her story gives me courage." It wasn't just about her anymore. It was about all of them. Her father had warned her that going public would bring attention, but he also reminded her why it mattered. "You have a chance to make people listen," he said over breakfast. "Not just for you, but for everyone who feels invisible." Amara nodded, though she still felt nervous. She wasn't used to being in the spotlight. Still, she knew deep down that staying silent wasn't an option. Not this time. As the day unfolded, news outlets picked up the story, turning it into a national conversation. Protesters gathered outside police stations across the country, holding signs that read, "Respect our humanity," and "No more excuses." The video of the traffic stop became a rallying cry, highlighting not only Amara's experience but also the broader issues of bias and inequality within law enforcement. People shared their own stories online, creating a wave of solidarity that spread far beyond what anyone expected. Behind the scenes, Her father worked tirelessly to ensure the investigation stayed on track. He assigned an independent task force to review the officer's conduct, bypassing internal departments to avoid any hint of favoritism or cover-ups. He wanted the process to be transparent, fair, and thorough. Every piece of evidence mattered, from dashcam footage to witness testimonies, and his team left no stone unturned. Meanwhile, the two officers involved, Grayson and Daniels, were sinking deeper into panic. When they learned that the Justice Minister himself was directly involved, their confidence shattered. They realized they weren't dealing with just another routine complaint. They were facing someone with power, influence, and a reputation for fighting corruption. Their attempts to cover their tracks only made things worse. Investigators uncovered deleted messages, suspicious transactions, and even past complaints filed against them for similar behavior. It was clear they had a pattern of targeting individuals based on race, class, and appearance. Grayson broke first. Sitting in his small apartment late one night, he stared at his phone, scrolling through endless articles about the scandal. His name was everywhere, painted as part of a system that oppressed rather than protected. He couldn't sleep, couldn't eat. The weight of guilt and fear crushed him. Finally, he called his lawyer, desperate for advice. "What if I cooperate?" he asked, his voice trembling. "Can I get out of this?" His lawyer hesitated before answering. "It depends. If you're willing to testify against Daniels, it might help your case." Grayson didn't hesitate. He agreed to spill everything he knew, hoping it would save him from the worst consequences. Over the next few days, he sat down with investigators, detailing not only the events of that night, but also other incidents where Daniels had crossed ethical lines. Grayson admitted they often joked about stopping drivers based on stereotypes, assuming certain neighborhoods belonged to specific groups. To them, it had seemed harmless, a way to pass the time during long shifts. Now, those jokes felt like poison. Daniels, on the other hand, refused to admit fault. Even as evidence mounted against him, he clung to denial, claiming the video was taken out of context and that his comments were misunderstood. "We were just doing our jobs," he insisted during interviews with investigators. But his arrogance only dug him deeper into trouble. Witnesses came forward corroborating Grayson's statements and adding new layers to the case. One former colleague revealed that Daniels had once bragged about profiling drivers, saying it was easier to spot troublemakers that way. The pressure mounted on both men, but it hit Daniels hardest. Suspended without pay and ostracized by co-workers who feared association with the scandal, he found himself isolated. Friends stopped returning his calls, and neighbors whispered behind his back. For the first time in his career, he faced real consequences for his actions. And yet, instead of reflecting or apologizing, he doubled down, blaming the system and accusing Amara's family of using their influence to ruin him. Amara watched it all unfold from afar, feeling conflicted. On one hand, she was glad justice seemed to be moving forward. On the other, she hated seeing so much energy wasted on tearing people apart. She didn't want revenge, she wanted change. That's why, when journalists started reaching out for interviews, she decided to use her platform wisely. Instead of focusing solely on her pain, she talked about solutions, better training for officers, stricter accountability measures, and community programs aimed at bridging gaps between law enforcement and the people they served. Her words resonated with millions. Viewers saw her not as a victim but as a leader, a young woman determined to turn tragedy into triumph. Even critics who initially dismissed her as privileged or overly dramatic began to listen. Her authenticity shone through every interview, making it impossible to ignore the bigger picture she painted. As weeks turned into months, the momentum grew. Activists organized marches, schools held discussions about systemic racism, and lawmakers introduced bills aimed at reforming policing practices. Amara's story became a catalyst for action, inspiring people to demand more from their leaders and institutions. Through it all, her father stood by her side, offering guidance and encouragement. He reminded her that change wouldn't happen overnight, but every step forward counted. One evening, as Amara scrolled through social media, she stumbled upon a message from a teenage girl. "Thank you for speaking up," it read. I've been scared to share my story, but yours gave me hope." Tears welled up in Amara's eyes as she read it. This was why she kept going, not for fame or recognition, but because her voice mattered. Because silence wasn't an option. And because somewhere out there someone needed to hear that they weren't alone. Though the road ahead remained uncertain, Amara felt a renewed sense of purpose. She wasn't just fighting for herself anymore. She was fighting for everyone who deserved to live without fear. And for the first time since that fateful night, she allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, things could get better. As the investigation into the officer's actions progressed, the nation remained glued to every update. The case had become more than just a story. It was a mirror reflecting the cracks in society's foundation. For Amara, the attention was both empowering and exhausting. Every day brought new interviews, messages from supporters, and debates on television. Some praised her courage, while others tried to discredit her, claiming she was exaggerating or seeking attention. But amidst the noise, one thing became clear. Her experience had struck a nerve, forcing people to confront uncomfortable truths about bias and accountability. Her father continued to play a pivotal role behind the scenes, ensuring that the investigation remained unbiased and thorough. He pushed for transparency at every step, knowing that any hint of favoritism could undermine the entire process. His team worked around the clock, gathering evidence, interviewing witnesses, and analyzing patterns in the officers' behavior. What they uncovered painted a damning picture, not only of Daniels and Grayson but also of a system that allowed such attitudes to fester unchecked. During this time, Amara found herself attending protests and community meetings, standing alongside people who shared her pain. At first, she felt out of place, unsure if she belonged among seasoned activists who had been fighting these battles long before her name made headlines. But their warmth and encouragement quickly put her at ease. They welcomed her as part of their movement, not because of her last name or viral fame, but because she was willing to use her voice to amplify theirs. One evening, after speaking at a rally, an elderly woman approached her with tears in her eyes. "You remind me of my granddaughter," she said softly, clasping Amara's hand. "She went through something similar, but she didn't have the strength to speak up. Thank you for being brave enough to stand where she couldn't." Those words stayed with Amara, fueling her determination to keep going even when the pressure felt overwhelming. Meanwhile, Daniels and Grayson faced mounting consequences. Suspended without pay and stripped of their badges pending trial, they struggled to cope with the fallout. Grayson, now cooperating fully with investigators, lived in constant fear of retaliation. He avoided public spaces, rarely left his apartment, and spent sleepless nights replaying the events in his mind. Each confession he gave weighed heavily on him, though he knew it was too late to undo the damage he'd caused. Daniels, however, refused to show remorse. In interviews with investigators, he doubled down on his earlier claims, insisting that he had done nothing wrong. "I was just doing my job," he repeated stubbornly, despite overwhelming evidence proving otherwise. His arrogance alienated even those who might have sympathized with him, leaving him isolated and bitter. Friends distanced themselves, colleagues avoided him, and his family grew increasingly frustrated with his refusal to take responsibility. The courtroom atmosphere was tense when the trial finally began. Supporters of Amara filled one side of the gallery, holding signs and wearing shirts emblazoned with slogans like "Justice without bias" and "Enough is enough." On the other side sat the families of the accused officers, visibly anxious but silent. Reporters packed the room, eager to capture every detail of what promised to be a landmark case. The prosecution presented its case methodically, laying out a timeline of events supported by video footage, audio recordings, and witness testimonies. The viral clip of the traffic stop played multiple times, each viewing eliciting gasps and murmurs from the audience. Investigators testified about the pattern of discriminatory behavior uncovered during their review of Daniels and Grayson's records. Former colleagues described how the two men often joked about profiling drivers based on stereotypes, treating it as a game rather than a serious issue. Grayson's testimony marked a turning point in the trial. Sitting nervously on the stand, he admitted to everything: his role in the traffic stop, the derogatory comments, and the attempts to cover their tracks afterward. His voice cracked as he apologized, not just to Amara but to everyone affected by his actions. "I let my prejudices cloud my judgment," he said, looking directly at Amara, "and for that I am truly sorry." Daniels, however, remained defiant. When it was his turn to testify, he denied all accusations, blaming the media and accusing Amara's family of orchestrating a witch hunt. His defense attorney argued that the officers were simply following protocol and that the backlash was disproportionate to their alleged misconduct. But the jury wasn't convinced. After weeks of testimony and deliberation, the verdict arrived. The courtroom fell silent as the judge read the decision aloud. Daniels was found guilty of misconduct, obstruction of justice, and violating civil rights. He was sentenced to 5 years in prison and permanently barred from working in law enforcement. Grayson, due to his cooperation and remorse, received a reduced sentence of 3 years, along with mandatory counseling and community service. For Amara, the verdict brought a mix of emotions: relief, vindication, and a lingering sadness. Justice had been served, but it didn't erase the pain she'd endured. Still, she recognized the significance of the moment. This wasn't just about punishing 2 individuals. It was about holding a broken system accountable and sending a message that no one was above the law, not even those sworn to uphold it. Outside the courthouse, reporters swarmed her, asking for her reaction. Instead of focusing on retribution, Amara spoke about hope. "This isn't the end," she said firmly. "It's the beginning of a conversation we need to keep having. We deserve a world where everyone is treated with dignity and respect, regardless of who they are or where they come from." Her father stood beside her, pride evident in his eyes. He knew the fight wasn't over, but he also saw how far they'd come. Together, they had turned a personal tragedy into a catalyst for change, inspiring countless others to join the movement. That night, as Amara lay in bed, she reflected on everything that had happened. Though the scars would always remain, she felt a sense of purpose stronger than ever before. She realized that true strength wasn't about avoiding pain. It was about using it to build something better. And for the first time in months, she allowed herself to dream of a future where stories like hers wouldn't make headlines because they simply wouldn't exist anymore. The courtroom verdict sent shockwaves through the nation. For many, it was a moment of validation, a sign that accountability could still exist, even in systems riddled with flaws. But for Amara, it wasn't just about winning or losing. It was about what came next. The trial had exposed ugly truths about bias and discrimination, but it also opened doors for meaningful conversations about how to fix them. As she stood outside the courthouse that day, surrounded by supporters and journalists, she knew her journey was far from over. Her father echoed this sentiment during an impromptu press conference later that afternoon. "Today's ruling is not the end," he said, his voice steady yet filled with emotion. "It's a step toward healing, yes, but more importantly, it's a call to action. We cannot afford to go back to business as usual. Our institutions must reflect fairness, integrity, and humanity. That starts now." Amara listened intently as her father spoke, feeling both proud and inspired. She admired his ability to channel anger into purpose, turning moments of injustice into opportunities for change. Growing up, she'd watched him fight tirelessly for reforms, often at great personal cost. Now, standing beside him, she understood why he never gave up. Change didn't happen overnight. It required patience, persistence, and unwavering belief in the possibility of a better tomorrow. In the days following the verdict, Amara decided to take matters into her own hands. She couldn't sit idly by while others debated solutions. She wanted to be part of the solution herself. Drawing inspiration from her father's work and the activists she'd met along the way, she founded a nonprofit organization aimed at educating young people about civil rights and empowering marginalized communities to share their stories. She called it Voices Unsilenced, a name that reflected her mission to amplify voices often ignored or dismissed. The idea came to her one evening while scrolling through social media. She noticed countless messages from people sharing their own experiences of discrimination, many of whom felt too afraid to speak out publicly. Some were students, others were parents, teachers, or workers, all united by the same desire for justice. Reading their words, Amara realized there was power in storytelling. When people shared their struggles, they weren't just unburdening themselves. They were building connections, fostering empathy, and demanding accountability. With help from her family and mentors, she launched Voices Unsilenced within weeks. The organization hosted workshops, panel discussions, and online forums where individuals could learn about their rights, discuss systemic issues, and brainstorm ways to create positive change. They partnered with schools, community centers, and advocacy groups to reach as many people as possible. Amara traveled across the country, speaking at events and meeting those eager to join the movement. Everywhere she went, she saw passion and determination, the kind that reminded her of her own resolve. One event held in a bustling city auditorium left a particularly deep impression on her. Hundreds of attendees packed the space, eager to hear from guest speakers and participate in breakout sessions. During one session focused on police reform, a young man named Carlos stood up to share his story. He recounted being stopped multiple times by officers simply for walking home late at night. Each encounter left him shaken and distrustful, yet he rarely told anyone because he feared being labeled as troublemaker. "I thought it was just me," Carlos admitted, his voice trembling slightly. "But hearing everyone else's stories, today, I realize I'm not alone." His words resonated deeply with the audience, sparking applause and tears alike. Afterward, Amara approached him personally, thanking him for his courage. "Your voice matters," she told him sincerely. "Never forget that." As Voices Unsilenced gained traction, so did calls for broader institutional changes. Lawmakers introduced bills aimed at increasing transparency in policing, mandating implicit bias training, and establishing independent oversight boards to review misconduct cases. Activists organized marches and rallies, keeping pressure on elected officials to act. Even some law enforcement agencies began re-evaluating their practices, acknowledging the need for reform. Grayson and Daniels' sentences served as stark reminders of the consequences of unchecked prejudice. While Grayson worked to rebuild his life after serving his reduced sentence, Daniels remained unrepentant behind bars. Letters written by victims of discriminatory policing circulated widely, detailing how similar attitudes had impacted their lives. These accounts fueled public outrage, pushing leaders to prioritize long-overdue reforms. For Amara, the progress was heartening, but she refused to rest on her laurels. She understood that real change required sustained effort, not just headlines or hashtags, so she kept showing up day after day, determined to honor the trust people placed in her. Whether it was mentoring teenagers interested in activism or testifying before legislative committees, she poured her energy into creating a future where no one had to endure what she did. Her father continued to support her efforts, using his platform to advocate for policy changes. Together, they became a formidable team, combining grassroots mobilization with high-level lobbying. Their bond grew stronger through shared victories and challenges, reminding them both of the importance of staying grounded in their values. Despite the strides made, Amara knew the road ahead wouldn't always be smooth. There would be setbacks, resistance, and moments of doubt. But she also knew that every small victory counted, every person educated, every stereotype challenged, every barrier broken brought society closer to true equality. And as long as there were people willing to fight, she believed anything was possible. Late one night, exhausted but content, Amara sat at her desk reviewing feedback from recent events. A handwritten note caught her eye. It was from a middle school teacher who had attended one of her workshops. "Thank you for inspiring my students," it read. "They left your talk believing they can make a difference. You've given them hope." Smiling softly, Amara tucked the note into a drawer alongside other mementos from her journey. Hope, she realized, was contagious, and she intended to spread it as far and wide as she could. Months turned into years, and Amara's journey transformed in ways she never imagined. What began as a painful chapter in her life had blossomed into something far greater, a movement that inspired countless others to stand up and demand change. The nonprofit organization she founded, Voices Unsilenced, grew beyond her wildest dreams. It became a beacon of hope for communities across the country, offering resources, education, and a platform for those who felt voiceless. People started calling her the girl who changed the conversation, but to Amara it wasn't about titles or recognition. It was about making sure no one else had to feel the way she did that night on the side of the road. Her work took her places she'd never dreamed of going. She spoke at universities, town halls, and international conferences, sharing her story with audiences from all walks of life. Each time she stepped onto a stage, her heart raced, not from fear, but from the weight of responsibility she carried. She knew her words mattered, not just to the people sitting in front of her, but to everyone watching online or reading about her later. Her message was simple yet powerful. We are stronger together. When we refuse to stay silent, we create ripples of change that can transform the world. One of the most memorable moments came during a visit to a small rural community, where tensions between residents and law enforcement had reached a boiling point. For years, distrust had simmered beneath the surface, leading to protests and heated debates. Local leaders invited Amara to facilitate a dialogue aimed at bridging the gap. She arrived unsure of what to expect, knowing these conversations could be difficult and sometimes painful, but necessary. The meeting was held in a modest community center packed with people eager to share their perspectives. Officers sat alongside teenagers, parents, teachers, and activists, each group bringing its own fears, frustrations, and hopes to the table. At first, the atmosphere was tense, with voices rising and accusations flying. But Amara remained calm, guiding the discussion with patience and empathy. She encouraged everyone to listen, not just to respond, but to understand. Slowly, walls began to crumble. A young mother shared how afraid she was every time her son left the house, fearing he might encounter trouble simply because of his skin color. An officer admitted feeling caught between enforcing laws and earning trust. A teenager confessed how much it meant to see someone like Amara, standing up for what was right. By the end of the session, tears flowed freely, not out of anger, but out of connection and understanding. That night, as Amara drove back to her hotel, she felt a flicker of hope. Change wouldn't come overnight, but moments like this proved it was possible. Back home, her father continued pushing for reforms at the highest levels. He introduced legislation requiring stricter oversight of police departments, mandating diversity training, and creating avenues for citizens to report misconduct without fear of retaliation. Though resistance remained, public support for reform grew stronger thanks in part to movements like Voices Unsilenced. Lawmakers couldn't ignore the groundswell of demand for accountability and justice. Amara often joined him at press conferences and policy briefings, lending her voice to the cause. Together, they made a formidable team, one representing grassroots activism, the other wielding institutional power. Their partnership showed that real progress required collaboration, a lesson they passed on to others through mentorship programs and leadership workshops. As the years went by, Amara's family found strength in unity. Her siblings, once hesitant to step into the spotlight, began speaking out too. One launched an initiative to provide free legal aid to marginalized communities, while another created art installations highlighting stories of resilience and courage. Even her mother, always the quiet anchor of the household, started volunteering with organizations focused on mental health and healing. They weren't just a family anymore. They were a force for good. Still, there were challenges. Critics accused Amara of being too idealistic, claiming her vision of equality was unrealistic. Others dismissed her efforts as performative, arguing that systemic issues ran too deep to fix. On tough days, doubts crept in. Was she doing enough? Could one person truly make a difference? But then she'd receive messages from strangers, people who told her they quit jobs that compromised their values, stood up against bullies, or pursued careers in advocacy because of her example. Those reminders kept her going. One day, while flipping through a magazine, she stumbled upon an article featuring Carlos, the young man who'd shared his story at one of her events years earlier. Now in his mid-20s, he had become a community organizer, working tirelessly to improve relations between youth and law enforcement in his neighborhood. Seeing his photo and reading his accomplishments brought tears to her eyes. This was why she kept fighting, for moments like this, when seeds planted long ago finally bore fruit. By the 5th anniversary of the traffic stop that changed everything, Amara stood on a stage surrounded by friends, allies, and supporters. The event celebrated how far they'd come while acknowledging how much work still lay ahead. As she addressed the crowd, her voice steady and full of conviction, she reflected on her journey. I used to think my worth depended on how hard I worked, how much I achieved, or how well I fit into someone else's idea of success, she said. But now I know my worth comes from something deeper, from knowing I belong here just as I am. And so do you. Every single one of us deserves to live in a world where our dignity is respected, where our voices are heard, and where justice isn't a privilege but a right. Applause erupted, echoing through the auditorium. For Amara, it wasn't just applause, it was affirmation. Affirmation that her pain hadn't been wasted, that her fight had meaning, and that her dream of a better future was within reach. When the event ended, she walked outside, taking a moment to breathe in the cool night air. Looking up at the stars, she allowed herself to imagine what the next 5 years might bring. Would there still be struggles? Of course. Would there still be moments of doubt? Probably. But would there also be victories, big and small? Absolutely, because somewhere out there, a teenager was finding the courage to speak up. Somewhere else, a parent was teaching their child about fairness and kindness. And somewhere nearby, a police officer was learning to see the humanity in every person they served. Together, they were building a world where stories like hers wouldn't need headlines to spark change. They'd simply reflect the norm. As she climbed into her car and drove home, Amara smiled softly. The road ahead was long, but she wasn't alone. And that made all the difference.